What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we are going to be going over my top 36 wide receivers as we head into week 6 of the fantasy football season. As always, every Tuesday we record these. They come out for you on Wednesdays. We'll go through the top 36, all of that good stuff. So keep in mind, these rankings are going to change throughout the week. Make sure you're a member of the Discord and make sure you are subscribed to this channel so you get those updates when they come to you. But that being said, let's not waste any more time. Let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these top 36 wide receivers. So as you can see, I got the tier maker pulled up on the screen as we speak. I got 7 tiers if we're going to get through all 36 wide receivers in today's video. And starting it off in my tier 1, we are going to call this the elite wide receiver ones for fantasy football here in week 6. I got number 1 overall, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. He plays against the Detroit Lions here this week. And Lamb, he had 5 receptions on 9 targets for 62 yards while adding 1 rush for 3 yards in Sunday's 20-17 win over the Steelers. Lamb has a really good matchup this week in a game against the Lions, who currently rank 27th against the wide receiver position with a projected game total of 52.5 points. He will again be one of the top players at the position here in week 6. Now moving on to my next guy, coming in at 2, Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. Chase, he caught 10 of 12 targets for 193 yards and 2 touchdowns in Sunday's 41-38 overtime loss to the Ravens. He has been on an absolute heater over the last 3 weeks, scoring 5 touchdowns in those games combined, and he should have another good opportunity to do it here in week 6 versus the Giants. Now, number 3 overall, I got Amon-Ra St. Brown. He plays the Dallas Cowboys this week, and he's coming off of a bye week in week 5, and we'll get a matchup against the Cowboys in a game that should have a ton of points. And even though Dallas has been very good against opposing wide receivers, Amon-Ra is still a set it and forget it wide receiver 1 for fantasy football purposes. Now, moving on to my number 4 guy, I do have A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. It sounds like we will finally get the return of AJB, who has missed the last month of the season due to a hamstring injury. If he is back in the lineup for Philadelphia, he should be one of the top plays at the position and should immediately help elevate this Eagles offense that has been struggling over the last few weeks. And now the last guy in this tier for me, rounding out the top 5, I do have Malik Nabers of the New York Giants. Nabers was unfortunately held out of last week's matchup while still recovering from his concussion, but I would expect him back in the lineup this week against the Bengals. And if he is, we need to be looking at Nabers as an elite wide receiver play because before the injury, he was seeing a massive target share and was a top 6 wide receiver on the week in his last 3 games. I would expect the same type of production here in week 6. Now moving on to tier 2. Tier 2, we're going to call the high-end wide receiver ones, and coming in at number 6, I got Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. He plays on the road at the Carolina Panthers in this one. In London, he brought in 12 of 13 targets for 154 yards and a touchdown in the Falcons' 36-30 overtime win over the Buccaneers on Thursday night. London now has 25 targets in his last 2 games and looks to be Kirk Cousins' new favorite target, despite Darnell Mooney also looking really good. But this week's matchup should be one that allows for another big Drake London day. Now coming in at 7, this is where I'm going to put Jayden Reed. Jayden Reed plays the Arizona Cardinals, and Reed, he recorded 4 catches on 6 targets for 78 yards in Sunday's 24-19 win over the Rams. He added 2 rushes for 19 yards, and Reed has certainly established himself as Jordan Love's most reliable target. And in a game this week against the Arizona Cardinals, there should be plenty of big play opportunities and upside in what is projected to be a high-scoring matchup. And the last guy in this tier, rounding out my tier 2, coming in at wide receiver 8, I got DK Metcalf. He plays against the San Francisco 49ers, and Metcalf, he finished with 4 receptions on 7 targets for 55 yards and a lost fumble in Sunday's 29-20 loss to the Giants. Although Metcalf's performance wasn't what we had hoped for in week 5, he still has 100+ yards in 3 of his last 4 games and is one of the top red zone targets for Geno Smith. I would still be firing him up with confidence here in a Thursday night matchup against the Niners. Now let's move on to my tier 3 here. My tier 3 is what I'm going to call those low-end wide receiver ones. Coming in at number 9, this is where I'm going to put DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. He plays against the Jacksonville Jaguars this week, and last week Moore, he caught 5 of 8 targets for 105 yards and 2 touchdowns in Sunday's win over the Panthers. So DJ Moore kind of got his revenge on the team that drafted him, but this Bears offense, it has definitely leveled up over the last few weeks. And even though that may mainly be due to the easier matchups that they've been playing, this is also an easy matchup here this week, and it should continue in a game here in London against the Jaguars, who currently rank 30th against the wide receiver position. So I expect Moore to continue performing for our fantasy football lineups. Now moving on to my wide receiver 10 on the week, I do have Brandon Aiyuk. He plays against the Seattle Seahawks this week, and Aiyuk, he hauled in 8 of 12 targets for 147 yards in Sunday's 24-23 win over the Arizona Cardinals. It had been a frustrating start of the year for Aiyuk managers and Aiyuk himself, who many were starting to give up on, but this is the type of high-end performance that Aiyuk is capable of in this offense. He's going to be boom bust, but now that we've seen the boom, I think everybody can relax. Brandon Aiyuk is damn good. Now coming in at my wide receiver 11, I got Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers plays against the Washington Commanders. And last week, Flowers caught 7 of 12 targets for 111 yards in Sunday's 41-38 overtime win over the Bengals. It was good to see Flowers finally have a big day again after putting down a 2-week slump for us in fantasy football. He's going to be looking to stack upon that performance here in week 6 against the Commanders defense that continues to bleed points to opposing wide receivers. Now moving on to my wide receiver 12, I got Marvin Harrison Jr. He plays at the Green Bay Packers, and Harrison, he had 2 receptions on 7 targets for 36 yards in Sunday's 24-23 win over the Niners. Marvin has been pretty mediocre for us since his blow-up game in week 2, only finishing as a wide receiver 2 or better in 1 of his last 3 games. This matchup with Green Bay projects to be high scoring, and they've been pretty bad against opposing wide receivers, so we can still probably throw Marvin out there with confidence this week. And then the last player for me here in this tier 3, coming in as my wide receiver 13, I got Stefon Diggs of the Houston Texans. He plays against the New England Patriots, and Diggs, he caught 6 of 8 targets for 82 yards in Sunday's 23-20 win over the Bills. Now with the loss of Nico Collins, Diggs looks like he's going to be elevated to wide receiver 1 in Houston's offense. The only problem with that is this week's matchup against Christian Gonzalez. It is pretty tough, but regardless, expect an increase in targets coming Diggs' way in this matchup and make him a low-end wide receiver 1 for your fantasy football teams. Now moving on to my tier 4. Tier 4, we're going to call this the high-end wide receiver 2s. Coming in at number 14 for me, I got Chris Godwin of the Buccaneers. He plays against the New Orleans Saints, and Godwin, he secured 5 of 6 targets for 64 yards in the Buccaneers' loss to the Falcons on Thursday night. Godwin, he certainly cooled off since the hot start that he had, and that's mainly due to the fact that he hasn't found the end zone since week 3. But in a matchup where Evans is probably going to be seeing the majority of Marshawn Lattimore, Godwin is going to have a chance to step up big for fantasy football teams and for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now moving on to my wide receiver 15, I got Deebo Samuel. Again, they play the Seattle Seahawks this week, and Samuel, he caught 1 of 3 targets for 11 yards, and he rushed 3 times for 9 yards in Sunday's loss to the Cardinals. Deebo, he hasn't given us the big game since he missed week 3 due to a calf injury, and that does kind of make me wonder if there's still some lingering effects, or maybe he's not 100%. And not to mention this week's matchup versus Seattle is tougher than last week's, with Seattle currently ranking top 10, but I still think we can play Deebo Samuel with confidence, but mainly just as a wide receiver 2 for our fantasy football teams. Now coming in at wide receiver 16, here's where I'm going to put Chris Olave, the New Orleans Saints, and he plays against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And Olave, he was held to 2 receptions off of 4 targets for 10 yards in Monday's 26-13 loss to the Kansas City Chiefs. This was a very, very tough matchup for Olave, considering that he was going up against one of the toughest slot corners in the NFL in Trent McDuffie. This week should be a lot better against the Tampa Bay defense that has given up some big games to other wide receivers lately, so we can still throw Chris Olave in those lineups. Now moving on to wide receiver 17, I'm going to put Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. He plays against the Buffalo Bills, and last week Wilson, he recorded 13 receptions on 22 targets for 101 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 23-17 loss to the Vikings. 22 targets is a ridiculous number for a wide receiver to see, and it's certainly positive even though he only averaged 4.6 yards per target. Now that the Jets have fired Robert Saleh, it's going to be interesting to see if anything changes, but despite that, the Jets, they do have a tough matchup against the Bills this week, and they've been top 3 against the wide receiver position, so we're still going to temper those expectations despite seeing the uptick in target volume for Garrett Wilson. Coming in at 18 for me, I'm going to put Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Bucks. Evans, he secured 5 of 7 targets for 62 yards and 2 touchdowns in the Buccaneers' 36-30 overtime loss to the Falcons. Evans, he has 3 top 12 finishes at the wide receiver position on the year so far, but this week's matchup with Marshawn Lattimore is one that brings a different type of energy every single year. I'm going to be tempering those expectations with Evans this week in this matchup with Lattimore. And then the last player for me here in this tier, coming in at 19, I got T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. They play against the New York Giants, and Higgins, he caught 9 of 14 passes for 83 yards and 2 touchdowns in Sunday's 41-38 overtime loss to the Ravens. Now Higgins, he has seen 24 targets over the last 2 games, proving why he is a valuable piece in this Bengals offense. And this week versus the Giants, he should look to be a very safe play with some touchdown upside as well. Now moving on to my tier 5, we're going to call this low-end wide receiver 2s. Coming in at my 20th overall wide receiver, I got Devontae Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. They play against the Cleveland Browns this week, and Smith, he's missed the last 2 games due to a concussion and the Eagles bye week, but it sounds like they expect him to be back in the lineup here this week against the Browns, and Smith, he should immediately be considered a wide receiver 2 play in a matchup that should also allow A.J. Brown and Saquon Barkley to take the majority of the defensive focus. Now, coming in at 21, I got Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. McLaurin, he caught 4 of 8 targets for 112 yards in Sunday's win over the Browns. He added 2 rushing yards on his only carry, and the Commanders' offense as a whole has really heated up over the last 3 weeks, and so has Terry McLaurin. He should be in store for another solid game here in Week 6 versus the Ravens, and I'd be more than comfortable playing him as my wide receiver 2. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 22, I got Deontay Johnson. He plays against the Atlanta Falcons, and Johnson, he secured 3 of 6 targets for 23 yards in the Panthers' loss to the Bears on Sunday. He also rushed twice for 6 yards, but Johnson, he had his first bad day since the quarterback switched to Andy Dalton in this Panthers offense, but the Jalen Johnson coverage was a big reason why he didn't excel, in my opinion. This week should at least be a little bit easier against Atlanta, who is currently ranked in the middle of the pack when it comes to allowing points to fantasy football wide receivers. Now, coming in at 23, I got Rashid Shaheed of the New Orleans Saints. Again, they play the Tampa Bay Bucks, but Shaheed, he had 4 receptions on 9 targets for 86 yards and a touchdown in Monday's 26-13 loss to the Chiefs. Shaheed, he has now been a top 24 wide receiver in 4 of his last 5 games, and after seeing 20 targets in his last 2 games and a 27% target share, I feel like there really isn't any real reasoning as to why he shouldn't at least come close to doing that again for us in a decent matchup here against the Buccaneers. Now, coming in at wide receiver 24, I got Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. They play the Dallas Cowboys, and the Lions are coming off of their bye week here in Week 5 and now get a matchup against the Cowboys in one of the higher projected game totals of the weekend. Now, Dallas, they've been pretty good against the wide receiver position so far this year, but JMO, he still has some big playability and is in one of the league's best offenses, so you can still fire him up pretty comfortably. Now, coming in at wide receiver 25 for me, I got Brian Thomas Jr. He plays on the road at the Chicago Bears, and really this is on the road for both teams because this game is in London. But Thomas, he brought in 5 of 8 targets for 122 yards and a touchdown in the Jaguars' win over the Colts on Sunday. BTJ has emerged as the clear number 1 in this Jaguars offense, but I expect this matchup for BTJ to be the toughest that he has had at the NFL level so far. He's probably going to be spending the majority of his days shadowed by Jalen Johnson, and we just talked about how he shut down Deontay Johnson. I temper the expectations for Thomas, but if he does show up big, he proves us wrong, and he does outperform this ADP, or I guess this ranking, he just might be him. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 26, I got Tank Dell of the Houston Texans, and they play against the New England Patriots, and as I mentioned, Nico Collins, he's probably not playing in this one, so keep that one in mind. Dell, he caught all 4 of his targets for 38 yards, and he rushed once for -5 yards in Sunday's 23-20 win over the Bills. Obviously, this ranking is high just based off of the production that Dell has given us to start the year, but with Nico Collins likely out of the lineup here this week versus the Patriots, Dell should slide in as the wide receiver 2 behind Stefon Diggs, and he could see some of the deep targets that Nico has been seeing in previous weeks. And now the last player in this tier for me, coming in at wide receiver 27, I got Darnell Mooney of the Atlanta Falcons. They play against the Carolina Panthers. Mooney brought in 9 of 16 targets for 105 yards and 2 touchdowns in the Falcons' overtime win versus the Buccaneers on Thursday night. Now, Mooney, he's really established himself as a reliable target for Kirk Cousins, and this week's matchup against the Panthers should be another light matchup for Mooney to keep racking up those PPR points. Now, let's move on to my tier 6. The tier 6 we're going to call high-end wide receiver 3s. So this one, coming in at wide receiver 28, is Amari Cooper. He plays against the Philadelphia Eagles, and Cooper, he caught 4 of 10 targets for 60 yards in Sunday's loss to the Commanders. The matchup for Cooper last week was incredible, and this week might be equally as good, but the Browns offense has been horrific, and nearly half of the targets coming Cooper's way are uncatchable. Unfortunately, the situation around Cooper is dampening his fantasy production, and it does just make him a wide receiver 3, despite the talent that Cooper has. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 29, I got George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He plays against the Las Vegas Raiders this week, and Pickens, he caught 3 of 7 targets for 26 yards in Sunday's loss to the Cowboys. Pickens has yet to score a touchdown heading into week 6, and Justin Fields still isn't throwing the football enough for Pickens to be a huge factor for fantasy football teams. And I hate to sound like a broken record, but as long as Fields is going out there and throwing roughly 15 completions for 150 passing yards like he's done in 3 of his last 5 starts, Pickens is going to be negatively affected by the quarterback play. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 30, I do have Jackson Smith and Jigba, and Jackson Smith and Jigba hauled in 4 of his 7 targets for 31 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 29-20 loss to the Giants. JSN, he hasn't really had a ton of big days this year, but he's continuously working ahead of Tyler Lockett in the pecking order and is still the wide receiver 2 on one of the league's best passing offenses. Now, we should be expecting this matchup versus the Niners on Thursday night to be competitive all the way through, meaning a fairly neutral game script here for JSN to keep racking up some fantasy football points. And now coming in as the last player in this tier for me, number 31, it is going to be Dontavion Wicks, and I get it. Dontavion Wicks, he did not perform for us this week, but let's not let it scare us from keeping him out of the lineup here this week. A low-end wide receiver 3 for me, and last week he recorded 2 catches on 7 targets for 20 yards in Sunday's win win over the Rams. Now, Wicks, he still led the team in targets, and although he struggled to get on the same page with Jordan Love, particularly on the deep targets, if anybody has rage dropped Wicks back onto the waiver wire, I still think you can pick him up and play him here as a low-end wide receiver 3 in this week's matchup against the Cardinals. Now, moving on to my tier 7 here, this is what we are going to call the low-end wide receiver 3s, and this is the final tier here to get through the 36 players in today's video. But number 32, I got Michael Pittman Jr. He plays against the Tennessee Titans, and last week Pittman, he brought in 5 of 8 targets for 37 yards and a touchdown in the Colts' loss to the Jaguars on Sunday. Pittman, he's put together 2 very solid performances back-to-back, but that's mainly been due to the QB play being from Joe Flacco and not Anthony Richardson. Now, it does sound like Anthony Richardson will be back at QB1 this week, and the matchup versus Tennessee is tough as they are currently ranked number 1 against the wide receiver position this year. Now, coming in at 33, I got Wan'Dale Robinson of the New York Giants. Robinson, he caught 6 of 9 targets for 36 yards and a touchdown while adding a 4-yard rush in Sunday's win over the Seahawks. Wan'Dale stepped up in Nabers' absence, and he gave us his best fantasy finish of the year, finishing as the wide receiver 20 on the week. But with Nabers back in the lineup, the PPR merchant in Wan'Dale Robinson should go back to this wide receiver 3 type of territory. Now, coming in at 34, I got Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. They play against the Chicago Bears, as I've mentioned. Kirk, he brought in all 4 targets for 88 yards in the Jaguars' win over the Colts on Sunday, and this week's matchup against the Bears is going to be much tougher than last week's matchup versus the Colts, and Evan Engram should be back in this lineup, at least I think, at the time of this recording for the Jaguars, so we should temper the expectations with Christian Kirk. Now, coming in at wide receiver 35, how about Romeo Doubs for the Green Bay Packers? As I've mentioned, they play the Cardinals, and Doubs, he missed last week's game versus the Rams after missing practice due to being unhappy with his involvement in this Packers offense, but the team, they've lifted his 1-game suspension, and he should be in line to play here this week against the Cardinals. If he does, I'd assume he gets a little bit more involved in a good matchup that's projected to be a very high-scoring game, so you can probably play him as a flex / wide receiver 3 type of option. And now the last and final player coming in at wide receiver 36, I got Khalil Shakir for the Buffalo Bills. Now, obviously, Shakir, he missed week 5's matchup against the Texans with an ankle injury, and there's no real clear indication as to whether or not he's going to be able to play here in week 6 versus the Jets. But when he's on the field, he looks like Josh Allen's number 1 target, and even in a tough matchup against the New York Jets, we should be considering him a strong wide receiver 3 / flex type of play. And so if he plays, this is about where he would be in my rankings. So there you have it, folks. That is my top 36 wide receivers as we head into week 6 of the fantasy football season. As I mentioned, these rankings are going to update and change throughout the week, so make sure you are subscribed to this channel. That way you catch our future videos as updates come around and we can make new content about those updates. Also, make sure you are a member of the Discord. The Discord is the best place to get my advice, and you also get to be in a community of people, of like-minded people that want to help you with your fantasy football teams as well. I feel like we've brought a very cool community to this fantasy football space here at the League FFB, and as I mentioned, it's free to join, so there is no risk in joining our community as well. Make sure you hit the like button if you liked today's video. And with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you today, so I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.